This video is going to explore topic 8.2, energy flow through ecosystems. The acquisition of energy is ubiquitous for all forms of life. It is a universal process that all organisms need energy in order to survive. But the manner in which they acquire that energy can vary from species to species. All living things require a constant input of energy and matter in order to sustain life functions. Those functions include things like responding to their environment, maintaining homeostasis, growth and development, and of course, reproduction. That reproduction is directly connected to the ability of populations to grow in size. So therefore, energy availability in an ecosystem has a direct effect on how populations are changing, either growing or shrinking in size. All living things require energy and matter. The reason why these two terms usually travel together as a pair is because they are related to each other. But what we need to be familiar with is what makes those two things different. Energy transformations are the result of chemical reactions that take place within living things. We learned about photosynthesis and cellular respiration as really great examples of thermodynamic changes. If we take a look at this model right here, we know that plants are carrying out photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and that all of those consumers are relying on the plant, either directly or indirectly, and using cellular respiration to process their energy. But what's important to know about energy is that we say energy flows in ecosystems in a unidirectional way. So what that means is, if we were to consider the grasshopper here, this grasshopper possesses energy that another organism could obtain and make use of. So when this bird eats the grasshopper, the energy the grasshopper possesses is transferred to the bird. There's no energy that the bird has that's transferred back to the grasshopper. When this bird is consumed by the snake, the energy from the bird transfers to the snake, but the snake shares nothing back with the bird again. So that means that the flow of energy is from producer to consumer and then subsequent consumers along the way. Matter doesn't flow through ecosystems, but rather cycles through it. It cycles through ecosystems in what we call a biogeochemical cycle. The bio part refers to the fact that we find those elements sometimes as part of living things. The geo part means that sometimes those elements are incorporated into minerals and rock of the earth itself. And the chemical part refers to the fact that we sometimes find those elements as inorganic compounds in the atmosphere or in water. So this model here takes a look at phosphorus. We know that phosphorus is found in phospholipids. We know that phosphorus is part of ATP and ADP. And phosphorus is also part of our nucleic acids, making up the backbones of our DNA and RNA. So if we follow the path that phosphorus might take, at some points in its cycle, it might be incorporated into a living thing. Once that living thing dies, it could become part of some other living thing, or maybe it ends up becoming as part of an inorganic compound in nature. Over time, that inorganic compound, thanks to geologic pressure and time, may become part of new rock or minerals, and the cycle continues. These matter cycles tend to be much longer than energy flow. They tend to take a lot longer time in order for those elements to cycle through the different possibilities. When it comes to things like phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, all of those elements and many others are the things that make up our macromolecules, and we find them in living things, in the earth itself, and in chemical compounds in nature. The method by which organisms obtain their energy and matter can be broken down into two broad categories. The first one are called producers, or autotrophs. With the exception of a few locations on Earth like deep sea vents, virtually all ecosystems rely on these producers to introduce energy into them. The way in which they do that is via photosynthesis. Producers capture energy incoming from the sun and utilize inorganic compounds in their environment to produce energy-rich organic compounds. Once they've done so, they themselves can utilize those energy-rich compounds for their own growth, development, and reproduction, or they may get consumed by heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are incapable of producing their own organic molecules from scratch, so they need to rely on those producers for those compounds. They either rely on them directly by being herbivorous and eating plants, or they rely on them indirectly by eating animals that ate plants. This chart here shows a few more differences between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that do produce their own food. Heterotrophs cannot. Autotrophs can fall into one of two categories. They can be photo or chemoautotrophs. Heterotrophs can fall into the same two distinctions, either photoheterotrophs or chemoheterotrophs. We're going to take a look at a flowchart in just a moment to help us understand that differentiation. And autotrophs, of course, include things like plants and algae and some kinds of bacteria, whereas heterotrophs are all animals and fungi. This chart here will help us make the distinction between those four groups of organisms. This first question here is going to help us to understand This flowchart here is going to help us to categorize organisms into one of these four groups. The way we use this chart is by beginning with this question here that says, where does the organism get its carbon? Does it need to get its carbon preformed from some other organism? Or can it get its carbon directly from the environment? We're going to follow this pathway first and follow what happens if organisms can use inorganic carbon, like carbon dioxide, as their matter source. So as we travel down this path, we now know that organisms are utilizing carbon dioxide, but where are they getting their energy from? If the organism gets its energy from light and its carbon from carbon dioxide, then we'd describe that organism as a photoautotroph. These are where plants would live. If, on the other hand, organisms can obtain their energy from inorganic oxidation reactions, then we would call that thing a chemoautotroph. And the kinds of organisms we find living in this group are those bacteria that occupy deep sea vents and other extreme habitats. On the other side of this flowchart here, these are organisms that cannot manufacture organic molecules from scratch and instead need to consume them preformed. So, if an organism requires preformed organic molecules but still gets its energy from light, they are photoheterotrophs. If an organism needs preformed organic molecules but uses that inorganic oxidation, cellular respiration, as its energy source, then they're called chemoheterotrophs. This is obviously where we would be found. Using energy and matter is necessary for all living things to sustain life functions. In eukaryotes, it's through the process of cellular respiration that the energy can be obtained from those organic compounds. The remaining energy can then be used for growth or development or repair of damaged tissue, and especially reproduction. As long as there is a net input of energy into the organism, in other words, a greater amount of energy coming in than going out, then the organism can either maintain or increase its biomass. If an organism suffers an energy and matter deficit, then the organism will lose mass and ultimately may die. Energy transfer and transformations always include a net loss of energy. Those energy transformations, think of the second law of thermodynamics, also involve a reduction in the amount of work that can be done every time an energy transformation happens. The forms of this energy loss include the production of feces in animals and also in the form of heat loss to the environment. This is true not only for plants, but for animals as well. In the plant category, we refer to that process as primary productivity. Primary production is essentially photosynthetic output. So on the left side of this model here, we see a unit of energy, joules, that the plant is producing via photosynthesis. Now, the plant itself, of course, needs to survive, so some of that energy is going to be spent in the form of cellular respiration or lost as heat, and everything that's left over is going to be used to grow the plant, to grow new structures, perhaps even to grow fruits that can be used to attract insects or other animals that will aid that organism in its reproduction. This right here is referred to as net primary production. When it comes to the animal side of this diagram, we see the incoming amount of energy that was transferred from the producer to the consumer. Now, what happens with this energy? There are a couple destinations that we would find it. One is as a waste product. Another one is as a waste product. And anything that's left over can then be used to increase that organism's biomass. What you should take away from this is that ultimately a very small amount of the energy that was present in the producer actually ends up being incorporated in the organism that ate it. It's approximately 10%. Remember that number. We're going to see it come up again later. Energy acquisition and use and temperature are very closely related to one another. For some organisms, they use their metabolism, or energy consumption, in order to maintain their body temperature. Those organisms are referred to as endotherms. Endotherms experience very little body temperature change relative to their external environment. Organisms like this bobcat here, as you can see, its body temperature remains relatively consistent regardless of what the ambient temperature is like. This is in contrast to an ectotherm. An ectotherm has a body temperature that directly mirrors their ambient temperature. In other words, when it's cold outside, the ectotherm is cold. When it's warm outside, the ectotherm is also warm. Because of that, ectotherms will oftentimes engage in behavioral strategies in order to help stabilize their internal temperature. Ectotherms include things like turtles and lizards and snakes. It's not uncommon for them to sunbathe in order to warm up their bodies so that their metabolism can increase and then they can become more active. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of those types of thermoregulation. For ectotherms, oftentimes their activity is restricted to certain times of the day when the temperature allows for their metabolism to increase. On the other hand, an endotherm is disadvantaged because of the high amount of food and a continuous supply of relatively high amounts of oxygen that are required. Being an ectotherm, though, does give you an advantage of being able to endure longer bouts without food or water or even low oxygen content. But being an endotherm means that you can sustain high levels of activity and you're not limited as to what time of day you can be active. For an endotherm, although its body temperature is not connected to its ambient environmental temperature, the same cannot be said of its metabolic rate. This also applies to ectotherms as well. This graph right here shows the relationship between environmental temperature and metabolic rate. The blue line represents an ectotherm and the red line represents an endotherm. For an ectotherm, it's pretty obvious to see what the relationship is. It's a direct one. As environmental temperature increases, metabolic rate also increases. This is true because as environmental temperature increases, the organism's temperature increases, and therefore the subsequent change in metabolic rate is a parallel one. For an endotherm, the opposite is true, up to a point. As environmental temperature increases, the organism's metabolic rate slows down. The reason for this is because as an endotherm, the warmer it is, the less heat loss you have to your environment. When your ambient temperature is high, there's less heat transfer from you to the environment. So therefore, your metabolic rate can be slower because you don't need to make up for or account for that excessive heat loss to the environment. On the other hand, if it's cold outside, you're going to be losing heat more quickly to the environment, and therefore metabolic rate needs to increase to make up for that loss. Now you may notice that there's an interesting little region of this graph right here called the thermal neutral zone. The thermal neutral zone represents what's called the basal metabolic rate. At this range of temperatures right here, the rate of metabolic heat production and the rate of heat loss to the environment are equal to one another. If, however, we go beyond that thermal neutral zone, then things like sweating and panting and vasodilation to lose heat to the environment faster simply aren't working anymore, and environmental temperature causes body temperature to start to rise. We refer to that as hyperthermia. And if allowed to progress, that hyperthermia can lead to the death of the organism. Of course, the opposite is also true. If the organism suffers from hypothermia, that can cause metabolic rate to slow down such that the organism simply can't survive anymore. There's also a relationship between the mass of an organism and its metabolic rate. More massive organisms tend to have lower metabolic rates. Less massive organisms tend to have higher metabolic rates. Now, the reason why this is true is because a smaller organism, like a mouse, is going to be losing more heat to its environment per unit of mass than a large organism will. Think of this elephant here as being a giant thermal mass. Think of the surface area of this elephant relative to its mass. The ratio of its surface area to mass is very different than it is for a tiny little mouse. Per unit of mass, the elephant is losing far less heat to the environment than the mouse is. So to make up for that difference, the mouse has to have a faster metabolic rate than the elephant does. Another way that we can represent the relationships and connections between organisms in an ecosystem is by using models called food chains and food webs. These models illustrate the direction of energy and matter transfer from one organism to the next. They use arrows to show the direction of that transfer. Food chains and food webs are very similar to one another. The difference is, however, that a food chain shows a single series of feeding relationships, whereas a food web is actually an overlapping series of interconnected food chains. While you would never be expected to have a particular food chain or food web memorized, knowing how to read one is of critical importance. Just like that energy pyramid that we saw before, it begins with producers that then supply energy and matter to all subsequent consumers. Now, I can tell these are producers because they don't have any arrows going to them. Producers are the source of energy in living things in an ecosystem. So not having any arrows going to them means they're getting their energy from the sun. Then we can trace these arrows to find out who's a primary consumer, who's a secondary consumer, and so on. Before moving on, though, it's important to note that organisms can occupy different levels depending on what they happen to be eating. This woodpecker right here, if consuming pieces of the flower from the saguaro cactus, that would make the woodpecker a primary consumer. But this woodpecker also happens to eat grasshoppers. Since the grasshopper is a primary consumer, that means that the woodpecker can also be a secondary consumer. So depending on which pathway the energy takes, the organism can actually be classified in multiple ways. Earlier in the video, I asked you to remember the number 10%. The reason why I did that is because only a portion of the energy that's available at one trophic level can be transferred on to the next trophic level. About 90% of the energy that's available at any given level is lost, and only 10% of that energy is transferred on. This energy pyramid here actually quantifies values of energy available at each level. At the producer level, there are 10,000 kilocalories available. At the next level of primary consumers, only 10% of that is passed on. At the secondary consumer level, only 10% of the primary consumer level is passed on. What is the basis for this 10% rule? There are three main contributors to it. The first one is called non-predatory deaths. I'm going to use this grasshopper here as a basis to explain what non-predatory deaths means. In order for the energy that this grasshopper has to be passed on to the shrew, what has to happen to the grasshopper? It has to be eaten. But what if this grasshopper is not eaten by the shrew and is eaten by something else or just dies of natural causes? Then the energy that this grasshopper had would not transfer on to the shrew. We would refer to that as a non-predatory death. If this shrew did not prey on this grasshopper, that's a non-predatory death. The second contributor to the 10% rule is called digestive system inefficiency, and we saw it in an earlier diagram. You may remember that the caterpillar consumed 200 joules of energy, but not all of that energy actually got incorporated into the organism's biomass. Some of it did. Some of it was used to keep the organism just alive, but half of it was lost back to the environment in the form of feces. That's an example of digestive system inefficiency. The final contributor to the 10% rule is just loss of energy to the environment, primarily in the form of heat. This is especially true for endothermic organisms. Endothermic organisms require much more energy input than ectothermic organisms do, and so because of that excessive heat loss to the environment, that's another contributing factor to the 10% rule. So when we saw earlier that there were about 300 units of energy in that leaf, but only about 33 units of energy that got incorporated into the caterpillar's biomass, that's what the basis for the 10% rule is. Because of the 10% rule, if we were to calculate the biomass of each of these levels in an ecosystem, we would find that the higher trophic levels have much less biomass than the levels below them. In other words, if I determine the mass of all grasshoppers in an ecosystem and then determine the mass of the few snakes in an ecosystem, the grasshoppers by mass would greatly out-quantify the snakes. The availability of food in an ecosystem has a direct effect on a population's ability to grow or even just maintain itself. It probably goes without saying, but the more food an ecosystem has, the more organisms are going to be able to survive and also reproduce. So if there are changes to the amount of light and water available for producers, that means that everything that those producers support in that ecosystem are also going to be affected. Those subsequent trophic levels rely on those producers, so if the size of a producer population changes, that's going to influence the size of consumer populations as well. Finally, let's take a look at a few strategies that have evolved in organisms to take advantage of what food is available in an ecosystem. Because energy availability in ecosystems is always in flux, and energy is required not only for survival but reproduction, that means that an organism's ability to create offspring effectively is directly tied to those kinds of changes that take place in ecosystems. Organisms take advantage of energy that's available in two general ways, and we categorize them into either K selection or R selection. Some species are considered K-selected species because of the characteristics and the behaviors and strategies that they use, whereas others are considered R-selected. Let's take a look at the difference between them. An R-selected population tends to have a relatively short lifespan. They also tend to reach sexual maturity quite high. They oftentimes have a very high mortality rate with very few offspring surviving to reproduction. They usually have very little parental care, and their offspring tend to be tiny. For a K-selected species, the opposite is true. They tend to have relatively longer lifespans. They tend to take up a much larger proportion of their total lifespan to reach sexual maturity. Most of their offspring do reach sexual maturity because they have extensive parental care, and those offspring are in fact quite large. So how does this relate to population sizes and energy use? R-selected species tend to reproduce very, very quickly, very, very fast when there are times of food abundance. K-selected species tend to reproduce moderately but consistently and aren't as affected by changes in environmental food availability. So what would the population growth look like for an R-selected species? It would be very, very wildly dramatic. It would fluctuate along with fluctuations in ecosystem food availability, and it would also be very unstable. And that's what this red line here is representing. A K-selected species, on the other hand, because it's less affected by food availability in an ecosystem, its population tends to remain relatively stable. Now, why do we call these K-selected and R-selected? An R-selected species will grow at its intrinsic growth rate. Think of the growth equation where R is in the exponent. They will grow at their intrinsic growth rate when food is available. A K-selected species, on the other hand, whose population fluctuates around that value of carrying capacity. Thanks for watching this video. Until next time, take care.